really interesting. So
It is. So before I start, who had a chance not to check on homework? Who had a chance to read the document? Besides Ellie as a co-author. Okay. So we'll just kind of dig into it. Maybe Ellie can provide some clarification. Hopefully what I'm about to describe kind of speaks to what it's about. So last week I came across this document, which I saw that Ellie co-authored, and I've been familiar with this movement called, not a movement, but initiative by the federal government called the Open Knowledge Network. And basically what it is that it's an initiative to connect all the governmental entities across sectors. You can think of it, I guess, as a metagraph. So it's very knowledge graph centric in the way it approaches things. But as I read through the document, I noticed that there was, in my mind at least, someone's raising their hand.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'll jump in when you're finished to get more clarity about the OKN.
Sure, yeah, you could probably give it better justice than me. What I noticed is there were common threads between what I hear and what people talk about in the data mesh community and what's actually in their principles and what I see in OKN. And it's not so much, what came first, the chicken or the egg for me. It's always, for me, when I have conversations from different groups, it's always about this convergent thinking. What are people thinking about when they think about scaling any kind of information architecture or scaling knowledge sharing? They come to these similar conclusions in my mind. So I'm going to attempt to point those out. And then possibly, as Ellie mentioned, there's some more comprehensive thinking, or there's a delta between what she sees in the data mesh community and what is in OKN. So I'd like to hear that as well. But generally, what is this convergent thinking that is happening when we talk about scaling knowledge sharing? And I'm going to go ahead and point out the ones I see, and perhaps any of you can talk about what you think about it. So the first one, and it's spoken in the document often, is about scaling knowledge at a certain level requires a socio-technical kind of point of view. Now that's it's a very simple term, but that's talked about quite a bit in data mesh, and it's also stated a number of times here. So basically there's a combination between the social and technical and processes together as one that needs to be thought of as kind of the touchstone for everything else. So you see that on both sides of the fence here. And then the second one that's mentioned in OKN is this notion of multidisciplinary teams being essential. Now, I'm assuming this is applied at the domain level, in which case that is very much the same or similar to what data mesh is talking about, the idea of having multidisciplinary teams, and I agree with that. In fact, outside of both camps, there was a book that I read like 3 or 4 years ago that speaks to this. It was called Messy. If you haven't read it, it's a very interesting book that talks about this. And then they also call out this use, these are their terms, OKN's terms, the vertical and horizontal approach. So the vertical is about the use cases of the domain specific initiatives. And then the horizontal speaks about having some agreement, some minimal governance to define this common infrastructure. They also talk about, suitable versioning that's being necessary. Again, also something that's called out quite a bit in data mesh. And then they reinforce this idea of kind of this centralized lightweight governance board with a kind of a hierarchy structure that pushes out distributed governance. This is, in my mind, very similar to the federated, computational governance that they define in data mesh, except they attempt to make it more automated, but still, I think you can draw a conclusion that they're talking about similar things. And then lastly, what else? Last one actually is a question. So this is probably for Ellie, but OKN characterizes itself as a general platform, a trustworthy network of graphs, and it's also, a national scale data infrastructure. And I'm wondering, which one of those is it? Is it all those things? Why is it a platform and not something else? For instance, data mesh tries to steer away from calling itself a platform for a few reasons, and perhaps Phil can chime in on that. But they actually ventured to say that this could be thought of as a platform. I'm just curious as to why that is. So I will stop talking and get some thoughts on both of these. And I encourage you, if you haven't read this document, you should. It's a good read.
So I want to emphasize the terms that you pulled out because several of those were mine. So,
Good.
and I'll give a little bit more context to the overall OKN sprint, because I think that will also shed light on the opportunity and the question, your last question at the end. So basically, this is an initiative that came from Biden's Office of Science and Technology Policy, and they think that there needs to be like a shared infrastructure in the United States for AI, the development of AI, which allows for information exchange. And so they had this kind of mandate that came from the president's office. And they, the OSTP went to NSF to kind of figure out what to do, and they put together this big sprint. And when it began, there really wasn't, I think, a clear understanding of what an open knowledge network was. There were some people on the call that definitely had opinions, and the calls were, sort of these big brawls of 200 academics that were like fighting to define what this would be. The socio-technical side was completely represented by me, right? Everyone was arguing about, RDF versus whatever. And I was like, well, this needs to also consider people and where they are in their context in order to actually, have design that will be used. So I think there's a lot more clarity in general about, sort of what this is than there was to begin with, but it's still very much open. And so the report, like I would say that the reason that it's described as a platform as well as an infrastructure, as well as whatever else, is the fact that like it's being written by technical writers who have no idea what they're actually writing about. So most of the content of the report, like if you look at the use cases, that was all produced by each one of us separately. Throughout the course of the sprint, we had like 18 different use cases. Each were led by an individual. And so they took our team documentation and they kind of tried to like make it nice and put some frontis matter on it. I don't know if anyone knows the name Chaitin Baru, but he was involved with the NSF for like 6 years as a consultant, and he works at, I think, University of San Diego, but he's been involved in this kind of thing at Microsoft and I think Google for like 3 decades. So this is really like it's not his initiative because it's the NSF's and OSTP, but if you're familiar with his work, then you'll kind of understand where this is trying to get to. So the current position of the OKN effort is they've asked us to continue to kind of keep the community going. There were probably about 60 of us that ended up, remaining involved throughout the course of the process, maybe 30. So they want us to keep, making this interesting to others, and they've successfully gotten some kind of funding from Congress to fund like several OKN efforts. There's also been a program previously to build open knowledge networks, which are basically just like rather large knowledge graphs currently. And so, at some point we'll get the requisition and there will probably be this mad competitive dash between really me. I'm connected to like 5 or 6 of the use cases around climate change, energy, natural disaster, supply chain, like pretty much all the big ones. And the pre-existing OKNs that have already been funded and received like, $6 million each, which are things like the Nowhere Graph, a geographical graph focused on disaster relief, and urban flood network. Like, there's a few of these things that are kind of out there. So that's the position with the actual, progress from, or the goal of this report. And you're right that it's focused on, governmental coordination, but that's not by any means the primary focus. Most of the use cases that we came out with were public and private and, widely varying in terms of the stakeholders that would have to contribute. So we're really thinking of this as sort of like another kind of web architecture, maybe even the web that Tim Berners-Lee imagined, was possible to create by bringing in the metadata of knowledge graphs and so on, which, as we know, hasn't really taken off. So I will be pursuing grant funds in some way, and hopefully that can be around climate. The only thing, that we have to keep in mind, I think, for these NSF proposals is that they're focused on American only activities. So if you are able to receive funds, and I think you have to be in the country to actually do the work, which is kind of a pain for me with all my engineers in the UK. But yeah, so that's the current position. But I think that Open Knowledge Network as a concept is it's sort of like more, it starts to move into the front of house, right? So data mesh is obviously something that, you know, IT departments are curious or interested about, and that's kind of the target audience for discussing and thinking about that. But with the Open Knowledge Network, the essential piece that I at least see with, you know, talking about socio-technical design is the stakeholder, right? The actual business user. So instead of just thinking about how the data is being stored in architecture, you're now thinking about how that data sits in front of a screen and a person, and where they need to go and interact with, and how we can design to support those processes better. I don't think that that's true, like that everyone thinks that of OKN, but I certainly do. And I'm a primary voice in the space. I co-organized the workshop at KDD and so on. So, you know, from my perspective, this is something that could really open up the marketing that knowledge graphs have struggled to kind of do so far by focusing more on the use case, on the stakeholder, on the business value, and then connecting that into, you know, the sort of distributed architecture. The other thing is, you know, in conversations recently, Phil and I have had, we've talked about some ideas, and I'll probably say this incorrectly, but like a network hub, right? These kinds of ideas of there's centralized spaces, and then there's these connectivity points across the network, and that's both in the front end with stakeholders as well as in the back end with data. And I think that's the core idea. And I think that that's like that there's a lot of value that comes into thinking about things in that way. That's kind of what data mesh is from my perspective, right? There's the owners of the data, and then there's the cross connection points. But like, and I don't know a lot about, you know, sort of what a data mesh experience looks like within an enterprise. But from conversations that we've had, Andrew, it seems to me that there's some problems that aren't able to be addressed with just the data mesh approach from a technical perspective, a data perspective, which are mostly about the management, right? So like, how does one department decide to retire a set of data that is being used by another department, but like that they have to fund to take care of? How do you make those sort of, you know, dependency decisions? And there could be communication layer around that, which is live, right? You could, you know, send out a question and someone could return like, we need this, you know, and maybe there's a decision process that comes out of that. So, you know, it's like those kinds of people intersections with the machine, I think could be addressed through this lens. And so, you know, that's kind of my interest, is to see if I can help get that message out.
Yeah, no, thanks for the clarification. And to your last comment, I you know, data mesh actually doesn't spell out a lot of things. I think some of the things are assumed in the whole, most of the conversations that you see, or at least used to see in the Slack group there, around those details. You know, I think at some level it does speak to it when it calls out immutability that's pervasive in the systems, because that helps lend itself to people taking a snapshot that perhaps other people aren't interested in, but they are, and they need it, and or data contracts, et cetera. But yeah, there is some fill in the blanks. When you're speaking so high level, you can't always go back and forth into the details, but hopefully the high level principles or objectives do kind of speak, you know, that they're an anchor towards the details, I guess. But yeah, anybody else?
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to interject about the other programs that might be on your list, Andrew, in addition to OKN. And you know, there's the Blue Brain initiative that the Swiss have come up with, and they've used that for a number of years. And we had Sean Hill on at the Estes Park group a couple of months ago, and got a briefing on that. So huh?
That was excellent, by the way. I talked to Sean afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, good. And so just putting this on the table, because it might be a success story to emulate in some ways. And then there's something that's far less developed in my mind, and maybe Phil and Philippe know more than I do about it, but it's the Digital Twins program in the UK that you may have heard of, the Gemini project. And so that really starts from an open standards perspective. And we've got this basket of standards that we're trying to use to help create interoperability somehow, so that you can have digital twins at an organizational scale for public sector entities. Now that's like a moonshot kind of program to my mind. But it begs the question, you know, who's got the funding? And in the case of the US, we had data.org, was it? With the Open Data Initiative in the US when the certain administration was in power, and then all these things sort of faded away as administrations changed. So there's a long-term commitment that needs to be had here, and I don't know how to detect who's got the long-term commitment that we need to really pursue this.
I think it's really interesting, and Ellie and I, when we last spoke, you know, we talked a little bit about the development of the web itself, how that started, and I see the similar parallels here with these higher level sort of initiatives, and that is, if you go back to the earliest networks, they were publicly funded. So you had the ARPANET and various others dotted around the world, and they eventually sort of coalesced, and we developed then additional common standards on top of those, and some standards which were really promising, such as the OSI stack, faded away because there was a greater collaboration in some of the simpler, perhaps less egalitarian protocols, but they started to work, and they started to work because people could build them easily or relatively easily, and the standards were open enough and freely available enough for people to see that there was a general momentum. And of course, we got the internet as you know, the TCP/IP networks, that then we built the HTTP stacks on top of that. And to my mind, I think we've got some parallels here, because when you look at things like data mesh and knowledge graphs and the communities, there is, as Andrew rightly said, there's a lot of conversion in thinking, and the blue brain and the digital twins, it's all very similar, but what we lack are the semantic interoperabilities in terms of agreement across those networks. We haven't got to that yet, and I think we're still a wee bit of ways. And if you look at data mesh, one of the very interesting elements, I think, in that community is a lot of the conversation is focused around what I would term the intrinsic organization rather than the extrinsic. It's focused very much, how do we have different domains within our organization talking to each other within this mesh concept, rather than how do we talk across different organizations and achieve, you know, that wider goal. And I think that's a conversation that's still yet to be had. So I think that's where the OKN perhaps provides or begins to provide that bridge. And I think the OKN also perhaps, albeit a little bit clumsily, might be able to start to provide some of the semantics that the data mesh currently lacks. And I'm worried that in the latter, we don't try and reinvent the wheel in terms of some of the stuff that's already gone before.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Phil, because when I found Zhamak's first article, it's because I was looking, kind of researching, you know, cross-organizational collaboration. And, you know, I was looking at data trust and those sorts of things, and I came across, you know, what I was thinking and what Zhamak was saying. I said, though, this is a good fit. But it was kind of odd when I joined the group, because everybody was talking about what I thought would be perceived within an enterprise as a very contrived effort to create these domains, like putting the business with you know, the technical staff, wherein a cross-organizational effort, it's very natural. There are very specific, clear boundaries between the organizations. It seemed like data mesh applied even better to cross-organizational efforts than it did internally. And internally, it looked like it could be appear as a contrived effort, unless you have a very, very large organization which they're targeting. But yeah, interesting you say that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the semantics view because for me, data structure is a lot of interesting parts, not necessarily because of the structure of the data, but because it is the contract of collaboration. So going into the contract of collaboration, what we're building here would be perhaps boundary objects, things that are plastic enough, but that are suitable enough for the specific point of views that the organizations that use it have in mind. So I tend to find that boundary objects are interesting as a concept to look here. It's the social things that we can use together between multiple organizations cross-organizationally. And data products in this space need to have an inherent structure. And I think that is one of the major items with RDF that doesn't help us, because you need to have the boundary around the RDF to make it useful. If you don't have that, you cannot just share it and people will use it the same way, because it doesn't have the necessary constraints to say this is what the data needs to look at to be useful. So those are some important things to overcome, I believe, in when creating these shared networks across. So I was thinking of, you need to provide value. So Alan, back to your question there in regards to where's the funding, and we can also put it in the other direction of say, where is the value? Because if we follow that value stream, there will naturally be funding to ensure that that value can be created. So I'm thinking of those things as relevant here, and that we look to the structure of data.
And just really quickly, Philippe, just to add on to what you were saying, I think that there's an interest in really supply chain kinds of efforts that are really half-baked at this point, but there's incredible value that people are envisioning, and unfortunately they've locked on to blockchain as the magic bullet for it. But the boundary objects that you're talking about sort of capture the larger aspect of what's needed here. So back to what Ellie was saying, the use cases that we could just spell out, knowing what we know, and sort of prioritizing the use cases. You know, to my mind, supply chain might be at the top, because there's that kind of sharing that has to go on end to end for product safety, for example.
Exactly, and I'm coming from that space. So I've been working quite a lot with large companies for supply chain integration, and also worked with Lund University in relation to supply chain integration between multiple parties. How does it look in a supply chain? You can have supply chain collaboration between two parties. And so they did a Delphis study. How does it look between three parties and more? And that does almost not happen, because it's too hard of a social problem to control, to get that kind of a Keiretsu collaboration, unless you have very strict control and ownership of the entire supply chain. I think we're seeing similar effects here. So to your point, I think that you need to find the small enough common ground in terms of a boundary object that is very useful. And as you say, supply chain would offer some of those. If we look at some very successful supply chain projects across the world with UN-EDIFACT and other things, they are built on having common ground. You know what you collaborate on, you have the same units of measure, you have the same things, and you express those. What I've been looking at in this space, full disclosure, I'm from Different, so we're building data products or hosting of data products openly. But what I'm looking at for that is, for instance, the public domain units of measure to actually be encoded in a way that I can use directly. So there's a long list in PDFs and other forms, but I need to convert it. So how does it look? Where should we be sourcing those? And I believe an open knowledge graph for those kinds of commons would be very valuable for a lot of people. So they'd have the structures for them as boundary objects that are reusable, and in a way also automatable and distributed. So you know where to find it, and you can find those in, I don't know if this is the direction for OCAN, but I'm seeing these kinds of value drivers being there for industry and for others, where the commons really help.
Philippe, could you define, I think I understand what you're saying, but can you define your reference to boundary objects?
Yeah, so a boundary object is a social construct. So a map, for instance, is a boundary object. It's something that two people can look at. They find the direction together, but they have very different interpretation of exactly what the map is. It gives them just enough knowledge to actually solve the task at hand, but no prescriptions. It's a helpful tool to collaborate. So that is the sense of boundary objects. And I think we could apply that to the cross-organizational collaboration as well, to have those necessary waypoints. But most of the time we go too far in wanting to prescribe exactly how to use this common resource, rather than making it perfect as it is to be helpful when necessary. So we often go too far in defining too much to a specific target domain. I think that is where we often go too far, instead of focusing on how it will be useful for the many, and stop at that and help creating maybe the necessary structures, the necessary data for those use cases.
Yeah, that actually touches on a particular bugbear of mine, in that we often don't work at the right levels of abstraction in order to be able to have those conversations that are joined up across different organizations, because we get too low down or too concrete in what we're trying to describe. And I think that's the hindrance. And I often wonder, and thinking about the OKN and the hub concept and what you've just talked about there in terms of boundary objects, we need those frames of reference so that we can describe the semantics. And I can't help but feel that sometimes that those, if you like, those reference hubs that people can kind of hook up to are part of what is ultimately what's missing. It's like being able to go to a dictionary or something and say, that's the thing I need to be able to describe. There's the word, or there's the concept. And it needs to be pan organization so that we can have those common agreements. So I can pick up Merriam-Webster's dictionary or an Oxford English dictionary, and I can pretty much say with a reasonable degree of confidence that they're going to present very, very similar definitions to the same sorts of concepts. And that's what we need on the web.
And related to that, Phil, just to add to what you were saying, I think that there's a visualization of these boundary objects that we could work on. And I've been trying to collaborate with Greg Sharp on his pattern logic. And with the right illustrations, I think the pattern logic types could be components in a boundary object. And it's just a visual way of communicating different ways that things interact. And so it's the interaction and the events that need to be depicted from a process point of view, for example.
And some of the work that I do with my clients around building ontologies very much uses a pattern-based approach, because that's what you actually want, because otherwise you don't get the true integration, and then you end up being at that too concrete level, and it starts to fall apart. Because and I'm sure we've all been in those situations where we've gone into architectural boards or whatever, and there's a real old bun fight between what does this word or concept mean, because people get really hung up on the if you like, the properties that hang off that, instead of thinking just at the conceptual layer and then working out how you can blend the different views and lenses that the different departments or domains have around those common concepts. People think that it has to be defined in one concrete way or another, and this is why you end up with multiple definitions of the same things with sometimes different business keys, and why it starts to fall apart when they try to integrate at scale, because you've got then point solutions that try to address these issues, which comes back to boundaries.
One of the specific problems I've had over a number of time is, if we look to standards, we have the ISO organization, IEC/ISO, and they have fantastic guidance on numerous topics. And some of that content is public domain. A lot of it isn't. There's a lot of data and reference points in those documents that are more or less in the public, but they are connected to those documents which are copyrighted. And there is an interesting part there in terms of how may we use that. I've been trying to go through their website and try to understand how may I use that in digital form between myself and a company and a client. And it's very opaque in terms of what is actually allowable and permissible to be done, especially since when it comes to a larger part of the copyright, then it becomes their material. but it's okay to quote a small part as part of copyright laws. So where are we on those things, and how would that help industry to actually have a common references in general available in the public? Because we are more and more automating all of these things. It goes faster and faster, and it's actually stopping innovation to not have that kind of knowledge available. I don't know if this is a relevant topic in this forum, but this is one of the things I'm seeing in the common that will really benefit from an open knowledge, and having that in a graph form. These are how the things are connected and how they actually are helpful to others. But I'll leave that to Ellie in terms of moderator, because I think that is a deep hole to go into.
Well, I think that, I mean, so the question about data mesh and OKN, I think we are moving a little bit further away from that, but into the broader question that we are always fixated on, which is how do we actually manage data better? How do we actually solve these problems? And so like what is coming out of this, you know, the patterns and the boundary concepts and the standards, sort of these structural terms that that we can all tap into. It really resonates with the things that I've been thinking about as well, where like we almost need some kind of skeletal structure to pin down to, right? That is consistent, works in some certain consistent ways. And what I've been doing currently is focusing on sort of the action layer, partially because that's what's of interest in the domain that I'm modeling, climate, but also because action words, and we had another engineer, Andrea Westerinen, who had actually produced an ontology designed to take any kind of narrative text and produce a knowledge graph at the other end. And she had focused this on mapping actions of verbs specifically. And so what we see is that, you know, the conceptual framing of domains is highly dynamic, and people will fight to the death about what words to use to describe that. But verbs are essentially static, right? Like no one really argues about what it means to run or to pass something. And inherently, supply chain, like these interaction points always require a verb of exchange to sort of bring things together. So to say all those things and to kind of step out, I think that this is really a valuable sort of product that could be developed if, you know, if we have time to start a working group around, you know, the linchpins of connective tissue. Another thing that I've been thinking about are prepositional phrases, right? At, near, by. Those are really essential terms, and there's not that many of them. They can easily be represented, and then you can start to make sentences and to pull, you know, different concepts together. So what I'm thinking, I have another colleague who came out of the OKN Sprint, who's based at the University of Vienna and also Oxford, and he's super sharp, doing lots of knowledge graph, cutting edge work. And I'm connected with him around the supply chain use case, which is also populated by the big data guy at the census. So we have some, you know, interesting folks to kind of bring together. I think that it would make sense to look for funding in the EU, because most of our, or really all of our engineers are in the EU or UK on this topic, to build this kind of thing, right? Like we could say there's this open knowledge network action in the United States. Obviously, we need to think about how to manage AI or how to manage data at faster, more accurate, more collaborative scale to keep pace with AI, with automation, with improvements, with competition, to solve the larger scale problems that we're focused on, like climate. And we think that an approach towards that would be defining some, you know, essential patterns that everyone could borrow from to begin to find those connection points, and then, you know, at some point converge on the specific language or so on. I think that would be, you know, a huge, I think that would be a huge contribution. And I think that there's really open space right now to, you know, as Phil is saying, start the next web. And it's going to take leadership, because it's so foggy for, you know, everyone, that now's the time to jump in with the answers, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that came up in the earlier part of the conversation, and I think you summed it in part of your horizontal view, Andrew, that, you know, talking about agreements and governance, and to come back to the, you know, things like the copyright, we've got different jurisdictions that are all at play here. So it's not just about which regions would be involved in funding, but I think it's also defining what some of the legal frameworks that will get adopted as part of this. Because if you just look at something like Safe Harbor and GDPR and all the things that they've raised just on the level that we're at before we even get to these sort of at scale collaborations, I think that's going to be something that is going to very much shape what we can do and what we might do.
And having been through 2 grants already successfully funded previously, I think that this would be something that is workable. I think there is in general interest in these areas, and also I think collaborating over the pond might actually be something that fuels if there is actually a collaboration in place. Because if we're looking at the unification at the moment of the Western world comes together for a common cause, not to mention the war, I think that we're also seeing fertile ground for these kind of cross-organizational collaboration, cross-pond collaborations as well, where we see that things could be building up. And EU being a heavy, I don't know how it looks for the UK in general, in how it looks now that everything is with Brexit in terms of the collaboration parts, but I believe the institutional collaborations are still in play in general. I believe there is a possibility to create common ground across EU countries, because most often we see that it's not only local to Sweden. In my case, it's not only local to Sweden, but we actually have the possibilities often in these grants to go wider than just the local geography. As long as it's within the EU, then probably there is something with the UK that needs to be explored, etc. But I don't think that is a big hurdle in the end. I think if the idea is strong enough and that there is a direction, so it's important to check these grant size for what the current directions are, because usually there are a few things that need to come in play, but AI, machine learning, data models, and ensuring that data can be represented, open data initiatives, etc., are very hot at the moment in general. And we see that governments have started to understand what this means, not in technical terms, but on terms of the society and that it's actually needed for the companies. So I believe that could be something to open up, and we're actually looking to do something in that direction. We haven't formalized in any way internally what exactly we want to do, but we see that there is something we'd like to do in the open space for this. That would make sense, because we want to contribute back. We also want to build something bigger that creates impact via change makers. So yeah, let's explore this together. I'd welcome it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think so. There's a conversational series that I have with Kevin and Emmanuel, the 2 that I mentioned. Kevin is at Census and Emmanuel is at Oxford and Vienna. We are planning to meet next Wednesday, and I think it's sort of 7 p.m. or so EU time. If others are interested to sort of move forward, they're the team that is, like has the knowledge about the big data systems that I personally am not as technically oriented to. So we could maybe have a call to all convene there and meet, and then continue with a weekly, bi-weekly, or tri-weekly kind of exploration focused towards finding a grant. I think that once we see that there's sort of an actual thing to apply for with a deadline, it's pretty clear. Like we have a lot of ideas that can converge. We could organize it around sort of climate, which is a hot use case, always supply chain as well, especially with the cross-pond collaboration. That's I think a strong position. Or more broadly, sort of risk response, right? Like what do we need to do to invest in our data infrastructure and representation capabilities in order to be prepared? Because we see that there's a tremendous amount of need to coordinate with supply chain, with war, with so on, and we probably can predict that there's more of that coming. I think that's all very, very, very strong, and we could make an argument perhaps for some domain representation to explore what those challenges are between organizations. As Andrew pointed out, right, data mesh is kind of ideally positioned for cross-organization collab, but I think that there's really few instances of doing that, and we certainly would like to be one of them at CA. And then it could also be, what are the standards that need to be sort of ready in order to make it simple, right? To, like, let's say you have the conversation with the stakeholder and they agree to try something. how can we really rapidly deploy, a prototype that has standards and patterns, or that is based on standards and patterns, so that it can address the opportunity that opens up, which has a limited time horizon, in a way that, is also going to be consistent with deeper needs in the data system. So like a just-in-time, like how do we manufacture data products in a just-in-time way to produce, this larger network infrastructure that we need?
Yeah, actually, before you said that, I was thinking about that, because there was a mention of open data, and I work on an open data project, and many can argue that there's a lot of data that's out there. The problem is to get it from where it is in a given portal or portals into something that you're doing that's interesting to you. That delta is kind of large. And in fact, when I was talking to Sean Hill about his projects, I said, what is your view of open data? He said, for me, the biggest problem is, he said, the state of the art is to go to like Google data sets in my world. And when I go there, what I see is a zip file. And a zip file has a bunch of files that are in there. There may be a metadata description file. There's a few data set files, whatever. He said, the work that we have to do to get that and get going is large. So it seems to me that if we're going to have large scale collaboration, it starts with one-on-one collaboration. That is the building block. That is kind of not to use the data mesh term, the quantum. If two people can collaborate and self-publish amongst each other without any barriers and be able to share and get going, in the same way as in the software world, where we used to have to get dependent libraries and code and compilers and bring it all together, then Docker containers came along and said, oh, just download this and use it right away. We need that equivalent across the board between that data, metadata, and code, where we can take knowledge, if that's a representation of it in the digital world, bring it in and use it right away, compose it right away. Without that, it seems, and at the individual level, without that, it would be very difficult to do what you're saying. But I do believe that's possible. In fact, that's where my mind often sits, is in that. How do you enable a single person or two people to get going immediately with knowledge that's at their disposal? Is it usable immediately? Anyway, just a thought on that.
And I think
Couldn't agree
that's
more.
the essence. That's the essence of the platform, isn't it? It's being able to connect producers and consumers, and to have the degree of trust that that what you're consuming is reliable, and you can use it, and and you may be part of a data supply chain yourself in terms of what you process. We when we were looking at the ESG stuff, Ellie, this was a problem that just kept coming up time and time again. Where do you find the data? And then secondly, having found it, can you consume it? And of course the reliability issue. And what we found was that actually there was a huge gap, which you talked to quite rightly, Andrew, that the gap between what we think we can do and what we can actually do has to close. Otherwise, this doesn't really happen.
I think one thing that I just missed, it was just a small thing, Andrew, which I think is an important aspect of it. If you don't enable tinkering, like for instance, you have Google data, you have all of these big things, the data is fixed. I cannot just download it and tinker with it and figure things out together with someone else. And I believe that is an important aspect, to make it available so that I can start looking at it and figure out how I can work with it so that it becomes like a chunk. And I think that what data mesh offers as the vision and idea of a data product, I think that is very apt to that description that you made. A data product is kind of a box thing that I can introspect and work with and understand from end to end. And I think that is what is very much missing in general, touching on many points.
I agree. Yeah, extend and incorporate. And one other aspect is, and I brought this up last week on Twitter, and it's still in my head, is this: we need to be in a place where copies are going to happen. When I take a piece of data or a data product, which is more than that, so metadata and code, we need to be at a point where people, just the standard base criteria is that we have replicas of data so that we have that lineage back. So when I get a copy of data, I'm really getting a replica of data, which means it's linked back to the original source. When they update something, I can see those updates and incorporate them. Right now, we make copies and then that connection is severed. What they do, what I do are now two different things. So we need, I think, this is more technology, but we need to think in terms of replicas of our respective works so that when something changes, other people can be aware of it and say, okay, do I want to accept this or not? Or et cetera, et cetera. So there is that lineage that is built in through replicas of data. And so that, you know, people can have their own also ways of changing things, and lineage is built automatically in some way.
I love this metaphor that you had with the zip file, Andrew. And in addition to what Ellie was talking about with the verbs, I'm thinking, okay, how could you build a container, so to speak, like a zip, and make it queryable and discoverable, and so and also have a description of the lineage that you're talking about. And then maybe that's also an element of this boundary object that Philippe was talking about. Lots of good ideas in this session. It's really, really helpful for me.
This is why we come together. This is
Yeah.
what we used
Yeah.
to do more frequently. So we'll have to start up again. I think there's a couple of other thoughts to point out around this concept of replicas and lineage. And I think that those two concepts are really, there's almost like so I'm thinking pulling out of this, you know, we should talk about the data supply chain, because the data supply chain is actually what the supply chain and ESG and everything is based on, but we don't have any concept of that, right? There's all these people, you know, sort of like having a one-on-one experience with data and either being frustrated or wasting a lot of time or not being able to do something, but there's no actual sort of terminology to capture that means that literally, you know, you're experiencing a bottleneck or some kind of other problem in the supply chain that is truly, that actually does exist. It's just really poorly contained. And so this is where we see like, you know, we use Google for searching for data because they are the only ones who have, you know, put enough resources into actually producing some kind of solution to the data supply chain challenge. And it's not even that great, but it's still state of the art, right? So I was recently at NASA doing an ontology development workshop, and they were talking about using Google Scholar in terms of instead of their internal search, because it produces better results, right? So until we actually create sort of the answers to these, you know, one-on-one, direct party to party, but also party to like sort of repository, right? Like where is there a data product that I can access? Until we have those patterns, I think we are going to be limited to the sort of dependency on these other large companies. So I think framing it that way is really easy to comprehend for non-technical stakeholders. And so I think also that lineage and replica are two of the concepts that kind of go into the data supply chain. Lineage is also important not only for thinking about the provenance of the data itself, but even for stakeholders. So one of the concepts that came up during the conversation with NASA was, in science, as they explore something new, they create terms. And then as they understand more about the space, the terms converge. But it's very confusing for newcomers, like PhD students, to come in and then try to like read the tracks of what happened, right? They have to look at the terms and figure out on their own that these are all actually the same thing now. And it's a huge like uncertainty space. And you can imagine that that's probably true of other technical fields. So how can we present lineage of like, change in concepts and referral concepts in a domain over time? The other thing, replica. So I think we talked about this too, Andrew, previously, like when someone changes a table, right, an Excel table, they change the schema, now it's permanently changed, right? Like you have total authorial control and it can be done so easily, and it can break everything that is connected to that, which is of course invisible. So also this idea of replicating schemas where there's some kind of like immutable, truly immutable backbone structure that then has, sort of replicated concepts where an individual could say, oh, the way that this is phrased doesn't quite make sense to me, so I'm going to shape that. But it doesn't, but we can like in the back end connect that instance of the file is identical to the instance of the other file with maybe like whatever changes the various stakeholders make beyond that. But there's like some way to sort of ground and anchor things in a way that is not editable, because that seems to be the problem, right? Is when you edit something, then it breaks all the other things that are in that chain, and we don't know what those are.
Yeah, the tools that we have at our disposal at the individual level don't have those temporal aspects or ways to migrate or do independent branches. They've done that in software, with developing code to a certain degree. We just need to broaden that to, our definition, in my view, of digital knowledge, and incorporate all the elements of knowledge as we represent it digitally, which is, and Alan has talked about this as well. When we first met, we talked about this about, data, metadata, and logic together as one individual unit, and being able to manage that temporally, so that we can be independent and branch off in our thinking, but still have that tether back to the original source and et cetera. So, yeah.
I was thinking that I wanted to summarize, because I find you express it elegantly, Ellie, in there, and I find it to be in terms of coalesced and agreed common references or terms, and in terms of what we're trying to figure out to some of those parts where we need those boundary objects. They're good enough for the collaboration to actually flourish where it wouldn't flourish otherwise. So to have those agreed common references is a key part in that, and that happens in software space by picking the good pull requests from software that is good, that we want to have, and we're not picking the other parts. But everyone is free to tinker and see if they're, like the selfish gene, the things that actually are good, they survive, and they manage to go to the further goal. So that probably, in terms of knowledge, is something that we need to do in the meme building space. I'm thinking of those analogies, at least.
Yeah, I sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Phil.
Okay, so I was thinking along the lines, we've touched on this in this conversation and one or two other conversations of the concept for, Git for data. And I think that's where we're almost headed, because one, you can do temporal assertions in Git in terms of understanding something like a block of code, because we've got the agreement of what a block of code looks like in a given language. So we can do the deltas and we can see what's changed. And because we've got the agreement, if you like, what that document structure looks like, we can then do that almost that individual part within the document to say, this is actually the thing that we want to keep, versus some other piece that, we think actually that ought to be discarded because either it clashes or it no longer meets the definition that we're working to. And that then takes us into process and workflow, which I think you mentioned earlier, Alan, which is a topic that doesn't come up a lot in terms of these networks. We tend to focus more on the structure of the data, but very often not in terms of the flow mechanics of how those things move and what the processes are in terms of making that happen. And I think those two parts, very much two sides of the same coin, that if we don't address, then we're always going to be short.
Yeah, it's a continuing issue, isn't it, Phil? And I think about robotic process automation and sort of a Band-Aid approach to working across applications and capturing what a routine process is and sort of creating a macro that captures it. But can you mine the code in the RPA somehow and abstract it? So there's this kind of metacode, if you will, Andrew, that also needs to be in play here, because that's where people are working and actually trying to accomplish things.
Quite insightful, both Alan and Phil. And what I think here, I'm looking back, I helped a contact center for a global company to change their ways of working. And we used very successful the knowledge-centered support, which is a methodology to capture just enough knowledge that is valuable, but you don't go too far. You build it incrementally. And I think that might be relevant to actually look into for these kind of processes. And I feel very well captured in terms of the processes and workflows around it that needs to be there. It needs to be valuable enough, but you don't go too far before actually having validated. It's kind of the iterative agile approach to building knowledge as well.
One other thing that I just wanted to raise as an issue, given that Ellie is on the call and has this understanding of the OKN. Ellie, I know you were working quite a bit on a standard set of metrics or a shared set of metrics, let's say. I'm sure that organizations are really keen on getting a group of metrics that they can use for benchmarking and comparison to others in their vertical, others in their ecosystem. Is there a relationship between what you're doing with metrics and this topic at all?
So not explicitly. The structure of the design sprint was quite, static. We had to I had to win a lot of arguments in order to end up leading a use case. So we had a focus that's more functional on climate, specifically on, actually finding like everyone in a city and all of the sort of other folks that are doing research and acting on like the resilience of a city and the transition to climate, and putting them in a software that can sort of support all that, a knowledge network, which is really a different question than the biodiversity piece. And that's more of the metrics that you're talking about. However, in sort of the broad space of what I'm doing, those things are very much relatable. So really, it's just a matter of, finding, really getting the funds to get it built, and whether that's from one pie or two pies together. The remaining architecture behind the scenes is pretty much static.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the metric piece could be sort of bait for the C-suite, eager to try and do things in a different way and actually be effective on the climate front.
Right. And that's actually an interesting point, because one of the reasons so there's been a live conversation between Emmanuel and Kevin and I about, sort of positioning towards a supply chain use case or towards the climate use case. And what we would love is to offer ESG as like, and sustainability at aggregate level scale as the sort of the stick, or rather the carrot for participating in this network. The reason we've sort of paused that is because I don't have existing network contacts with supply chain folks or execs, and it would just be a lot of time to build all of that on spec. But if there is, a way to kind of, source enough people to create a prototype, that's something that would be really useful and interesting to know and to put into that proposal. Because one thing that we could do is structure the proposal around a series of very small use cases that are designed to connect to each other. So rather than a single OKN, we have like this, decentralized grid of networks based around energy supply and water, climate, that form like an actual, distributed architecture. So yeah, that's very much in flux right now. We expect the requisition to come out early next year. So there's a lot of time to define what the project could be. And also, even if who knows how that will end up, but there's also like, I think a lot here to take to EU funders who are, a lot more developed in terms of these topics. We could maybe go for Horizon funding and so on once we kind of have like enough of a knowledge of what we can put together pinned down, then it's just a matter of writing it up.
Could it be interesting to maybe put together some of those that actually work with the Swedish Innovation Agency to talk about these matters and how it might be relevant for Sweden/EU as representative of the EU grant funding system, and to talk about this specific problem and see where they are and whether that makes sense, and the kinds of grants that might be relevant to actually look into, because they are also creating grants. And so if they see that this is an interesting space, we haven't seen the specifics here. I don't know if it makes sense. I got to know a few of them during the pandemic. So perhaps it's something to explore. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Why don't we plan, I do have another call, so I'll have to drop, but why don't we plan to make this a routine call, maybe every 2 weeks, Andrew, if you want to host, or I can send out an invite.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. And then hopefully we can get Luke here, because I think also connecting with an actual knowledge graph database would be, helpful.
Right.
And if anyone is interested to join the call on Wednesday with Emmanuel and Kevin and talk more about the OKN specifics and sort of the technical considerations and just sort of connect with them, please let me know. I'm happy to add you to that as well. And then we can kind of see how this all moves forward together.
Yeah, one quick comment, Ellie. If OKN's to be successful like ARPANET, when does it break out of its national scope?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question to start with, right? Like if so I mean, NSF has this goal to build this thing and they really don't know how to do it. So if we come forward with that and we're like, well, we have a multi-country team, we have a very clear focus. This is what the goal is. It's this, it's
Right.
true web 3.0. Like,
Mm.
I think that would be really persuasive for them and compelling. And also, if we can connect that with larger, pools of funding, like a Horizon Fund or something like that in the EU, because the NSF will, I don't know, I think it's going to be like a $2 million contract maybe, which is probably not quite enough to go the full, do all the things we're talking about here. But if we had other partnerships, that would be maybe like a research network that emerges or something like that.
Something
this-
that
I'm sorry, does this perhaps bubble up to the sorts of pan-national or pan-international organizations such as the UN? Because I was just thinking they have, if you like, the infrastructure and the ability to deal with these sorts of issues already. So I wonder whether that's maybe one potential route to explore.
Yeah, I think if we had something, concrete, whether that was actually a prototype, I think that's like the ideal, or at least sort of a document that described, some of the things that are coming up and maybe more of the picture. I can start, an initial point based on the conversation we've had today. I think that would be interesting. And also, those conversations like the UN, the World Bank, those are people that are certainly interested in the domain space, the sustainability OKN. I would love to be able to have something to approach with.
I'm seeing an intersection here. I don't know if that is something that has been, so you mentioned Phil earlier, Tim Berners-Lee. And after he's done all of the work with web, he's been quite involved in something called Solid, which is these solid pods that contains information. And I don't know if you've all seen them. So, and the idea of them, what I find with them is that they're not structured enough to actually serve the purpose. They don't have the lineage, but in terms of the idea and spreading them and how you may tinker with data, they're the right approach. So perhaps there is a concept there to explore further. I'm intrigued by them, but I don't see them useful enough for the industry. For the one specific person, yes, but there is a scaling aspect to it that is missing. But when you look at knowledge, there is something else that happens with that concept. When you have the structure, when you have the schema, when you have the content, when you have the specific goal in mind of a supply chain or something else, then the problem shifts very much from a individual part of it into an industry collaboration part of Solid and the knowledge space and the knowledge graph that we see in front of us. I don't know if that makes sense or if it resonates, but I saw that pattern coming up.
Yeah, and Phil, Philippa, I will send over an article that I wrote on Graphmetrics, which has made a go of using Solid in a construction supply chain context.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
And one of the benefits is that you really reduce radically the amount of duplication in the documents, for example, that are being shared by architects and the others who have to use them. So there are lots of advantages, and I'm also thinking in terms of the IPFS as an alternative to Solid, and we could get out onto the table what the pros and cons of all these storage options are.
Yeah.
Very
interesting. Thank you.
I was thinking about the pod and the IFPS when we started exploring those as part of Data Mesh, Andrew, because the topic came up as, what's the architectural component? And for me, it seemed that there's almost, and I wouldn't say this as a 100% match, but when you start to talk about graphs and meshes, you start to see that there's an overlap in certain concepts. And I wondered whether these pods or nodes could be structured in such a way that they're small enough, and if it was scalable enough, to almost have those as the node on the graph. They are the unit of storage. So your graph then spans multiple nodes and multiple pods, and you've almost got a different kind of implementation to what we would regard as a property graph, but it's done by pods and these storage nodes. So you solve some of the replication issue, not all of them, because we've talked about some of the circumstances when you would replicate. But the question that comes to my mind is then whether you can start to then build some of that immutability as part of, it's just another replica, and then with the change, and then you can track those changes as those basically spin out. It's only a random thought. It's something that keeps coming up from piecemeal in various conversations, and I just wonder whether there's a glimmer of something there that helps maybe shapes how we might think about some of these networks, not only at the technical level but also at that social level, in terms of how we manage them and what controls we can wrap around the individual elements for things like access.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of the distribution, in terms of the social aspects, and in terms of making that social technical that we started the conversation as well with, in terms of the social technical construct needed to make such a graph viable and successful. That is not a technical construct; it's a social technical one, and with that comes so many challenges. So I think those are in that direction. I think there's a glimmer of hope in that direction, at least for me. So.
Good.
Great. Good
Right.
talk.
Yeah.
We'll talk again soon. We'll see some calendar invites going out, and I'm really looking forward to this. I'll also put together a beginning document, and we can add to that asynchronously. I think that's sort of the MVP, right? Is to make a document that describes this problem and this space and our vision of it, and then we can see what kinds of conversations that opens up.
Awesome.
All right.
I'll send
Bye,
out the recording. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you.